Okay, great. Well, I'm going to start by saying thank you, King Ho, for doing this. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to read your official bio that I got from the University of St. Andrews.
Okay, sure.
So that people introduce you, and then I'm going to tell us a slightly informal story. So Dr. King Ho Leung joined the School of Divinity at St. Andrews in 2019. He was previously lecturer in philosophy and theology at the University of Chester. And now he's a part of the New Directions in Philosophical Theology project, led by Professor Judith Wolf. And he was also recently elected as one of the emerging scholars in political theology by the Political Theology Network. I first met King Ho, it was like about 4 years ago, I think. There was a graduate conference, and I was giving a talk, and he was invited to give a 10-minute response to my paper. And it was the first time I had met him. And I come out of the analytic tradition and philosophy, and King Ho comes out of the continental tradition. And so it was really fascinating having a dialogue about the paper I'd written, because we were kind of approaching the topic from different perspectives. But I really appreciated the comments that King Ho made. And fortunately, I've been able to kind of stay in touch with him over the years through Facebook. And he's very graciously agreed to come and be with us here today. So thank you, King Ho.
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, it's good to just meet everyone here and just have a conversation.
Fantastic. Well, let's begin, if you don't mind, by just kind of introducing us to these two really important figures that you're talking about, David Bentley Hart and Jean-Paul Sartre. If you could just kind of give us a brief introduction to these thinkers, who they are, why they're important.
Yeah. Firstly, I don't know how important they are, but I think they are two kind of thinkers that are quite interesting to be put together as a little comparison. And David Hart, so often confused, Bentley Hart's often confused as his surname, but it's just Hart. So David Bentley Hart is a religious studies scholar who, he prefers that term now, but like most people see him as a Christian theologian from the Eastern Orthodox tradition. So he's someone who engages a fair bit with continental philosophy and more recently philosophy of mind, particularly in conversation with quite classical Christian metaphysics. So particularly engaging people like Gregory of Nyssa and that kind of stuff. So that's David Hart. I'll come back to him maybe briefly. And then Jean-Paul Sartre, who's probably more famous to the average person on the street, obviously one of the most well-known atheist philosophers of the 20th century, also a Nobel Prize winner who famously rejected it. I think it was something like 1950 or something like that. But Sartre's more known, as I said, as an atheist who is kind of situated in the philosophical tradition known as continental philosophy, and particularly two of the most influential movements in the mid-20th century, namely existentialism and phenomenology. Although in this particular article, I'm focusing more on Sartre as a phenomenologist as opposed to an existentialist, although the whole attention on existentialism kind of comes in through his talk on so-called ontology, which we'll turn to in a moment as well. Just one last remark. So we're obviously talking about a Christian thinker, David Hart, and Sartre as a atheist philosopher at the same time. But one thing is worth noting, I think that's worth bearing in mind when we are thinking about the ideas of these two thinkers, is that they're both not operating in a traditional university setting like most academics do these days. So, for example, Sartre was mainly became a kind of more public intellectual figure, writing a lot of popular articles and things like that. And David Hart's not in a tenured position either, so they don't quite. So they're kind of operating some insight. They're obviously well educated in the system, but the way they make a living, if you will, is not exactly through faculty salary and that kind of thing. So that makes them quite interesting as figures who have more freedom and are not quite kind of constrained by universities' pressure to publish in certain trends and not. So there is a certain freedom in terms of how they might express their ideas, and maybe adds to the boldness of claims and observations.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that brief introduction to these really interesting scholars. And it is interesting, some of the parallels you mentioned in their lives, not just in their work, as we're going to find out in a minute talking about it, but also, as you just noted, even there seems to be a little bit of a parallel there as in terms of how they lived their lives and, presented their work and their ideas to the public. Now, you mentioned two terms, phenomenology and ontology. And in your paper, you talk about phenomenological ontology. That's a mouthful there. Could you please give us I know this is probably a big thing to ask, but a kind of a brief overview of what you mean by that. What is phenomenological ontology?
Yeah, sure. To be fair, that's just a phrase from Sartre. So that's his subtitle to his main work, Being and Nothingness, published in 1943. The old translation, which is by Hazel Barnes, which is a good one, used to translate it as an essay on phenomenological ontology. But actually the new translation, which is really good as well, is an essay in phenomenological ontology. So that's slight, but either way, it's Being and Nothingness is meant to be a kind of project in phenomenological ontology. So that was basically why I used that word there. So ontology is, as most of you would probably know, the study or the theory of being, or what exists. And phenomenology is the kind of study of consciousness, or how consciousness experiences phenomenon, or for phenomena. And in some way, phenomenologists are often seen to be separated from the task of doing kind of speculative ontology or metaphysics, if you will. So for example, in like people like Edwin Husserl, who kind of began the whole phenomenological tradition in the 20th century, he kind of like, well, I'm just talking about experience. I'm not going to talk about existence per se. Not talk about being per se. And if we think about like the most sort of classical definition of ontology, if we think about like, say, Aristotle's metaphysics, a lot of it's talking about things like substance, accidents, act, potency, and stuff like that. So things we can kind of just categories, we shouldn't use the word categories in the by categories I don't mean in an Aristotelian sense, but just notions and ideas that don't immediately need to be related to experience per se. So we think about substance, accident of a chair, chairness is the kind of, I guess, the form, but you can also say the substantial form of its chairness and that kind of stuff. You don't need to experience it in relation to the chair in front of you and so on. Now, so you can basically sit in an armchair and do ontology. You don't need to be engaged in your experience. What Sartre tries to do, somewhat following Heidegger, who is another major figure in the philosophical tradition, is to try and root all this kind of ontological speculation or system building, if you will, in our everyday experience. So in some sense, it's trying to bring together both the attention on, if you will, first person experiences through the phenomenological analysis of consciousness, alongside the more, what we might call speculative, by which I don't mean like coming with random things, but just meaning more abstract categories. And yeah, trying to bring those two together into one approach. Does that answer the question on what phenomenological ontology vaguely is?
No, that's wonderful. I'm just kind of curious, as a slight follow-up to that. When continental philosophers, when they're talking about consciousness, do they have the same thing in mind as, say, like a analytic philosopher who's doing something in philosophy of mind? Supposedly they're talking about consciousness as well, but I'm wondering if there's maybe a slight difference there in what these philosophers are meaning.
It depends who you ask. So for Dave Chalmers, Galen Strawson would mean something else. But if you go with someone like Tim Crane, would be more with Sartre. Tim Crane, Denzel Harvey would be more alongside Sartre. So this perhaps is a good place to talk about this thing on what we mean by consciousness in both Sartre's definition, but also Hart's. So they both define consciousness in terms of intentionality. So aboutness, we are aware of a particular thing. Yeah, so that offness, aboutness, awareness of that particular thing is what they mean by consciousness. So it's an intentional consciousness as opposed to what we might call a phenomenal or experiential consciousness. So if you use the analytic jargon, they're not talking about like the qualia stuff, but more about something more concrete and directed, if you will. And just on a side note, in the continental tradition, some of the developments in French phenomenology after Sartre took a particular interest in Christian or religious ideas in general. And those guys start talking about counter-intentionality, so things that overwhelm our consciousness, if you will, or the way in which we understand things. And that stuff has been quite influential, particularly in Christian theology's engagement with the continental tradition. And part of what I'm trying to do in this comparison between Sartre and Hart is to actually push back against that move, to think about, well, we should actually pay attention to what we might call intentionality as the most basic mode of human consciousness.
Okay.
We'll come back to that later on. Maybe.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Yeah, I mean, especially for me, because I'm, as I said already, I'm coming from the analytic tradition. And so some of these ideas are brand new to me. I'm still trying to get my head around them. So thank you for taking time to explain that. This actually goes into, there's a quote from your article I thought was interesting. I'm going to read it. You say, instead of being something substantial in itself, for Sartre, consciousness is to be understood in terms of a relation. Consciousness is only consciousness insofar as it exists in relation to, or indeed it exists for, some being that is beyond and other than said consciousness. It is for this reason that Sartre characterizes consciousness as being for itself, a paradoxical being that exists as nothing but a relation to some being that is in itself. And I think that kind of touches on some of the things you just said. Could you maybe unpack that a bit more? So what does that mean for consciousness to be nothing and to be a relationship?
This is also a good place to start seeing how the phenomenology starts becoming an ontology, if you will. So as I said, Sartre defines consciousness in terms of what they call intentionality. So it's a kind of directedness of awareness, which he follows basically from Edmund Husserl, who I mentioned already as the kind of founder of the phenomenological tradition. Now, so in Husserl, there's the definition kind of goes something like this. All consciousness is always a consciousness of something other than itself. Yeah. So when I'm looking at this pen, I'm conscious of it. Yeah. So what my consciousness is of the pen. So it's always directed to something that is not myself. Yeah. So in that regard, you can see the directionality, or some sense, the relationality is always relating to something. Yeah. But for Sartre and Husserl, you can say the important thing is the something other than itself. So for Sartre, this goes slightly into a side point, but I'm just going to put it out there and we can ignore it. Self-reflection or self-knowledge, self-consciousness isn't true consciousness. And I'll just state that that's an axiomatic point he supposes. But the claim is there is something unique about consciousness because it's defined purely by its relationality or its direction to something else. And so for Sartre, he argues that means that consciousness basically has no content, if you will. Yeah. So this is perhaps overly complicating it, and it might open up a dangerous a dangerous route. But I think one way I like to think about this is to think about, like, say in terms of Aristotle. So he would say that the human soul is in some sense everything, because soul is able to know everything. Yeah. So you can think of consciousness in a similar way, because consciousness is nothing substantial in itself. It's empty in its content. Therefore, it can direct itself at the blue pen, at this glasses case, and so on and so forth, because the consciousness is empty in itself. So then it can push itself towards something else, to anything, in theory. So in that regard, Sartre would call consciousness nothingness. Yeah. So because it's intrinsically nothing. And just a bigger side point, and this is where the existentialism comes in. So Sartre's known to say that, well, there is no such thing as human nature. It's only the human who defines who he is, so on and so forth. There's no God who predetermines what the human is. Yeah. And that is because of the structure of consciousness as a nothingness. It is because it's nothing, therefore there's no human nature, and then we've got total freedom, blah, 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 so on and so forth.
So for him, if there were no other external objects, then there would just be no consciousness. I mean, so you couldn't have a world in which you just had a single consciousness and no other objects, I guess, or external entities.
Yeah, but that is kind of where he makes, so in being a nothingness, he actually makes this move, which is, I think, is an interesting one, because it pushes the analytic synthetic distinction to a maximum, if you will. So he calls it an ontological proof of what he calls being in itself, which basically means the external world or external reality. So traditional ontological proofs for the existence of God, this is actually more your thing than mine, but kind of goes like, you can work out from the definition of God into the existence of God. Yeah. So what God is somehow implies that God is. Yeah. Sartre makes a similar move, but that's why I argue it's actually pushes the analytic and synthetic distinction, because traditionally the ontological would be an analytic claim. But what Sartre does is to say that, well, consciousness exists because I think therefore I am, that kind of thing. But so if that exists, consciousness, analytically speaking, so by definition, implies that consciousness is conscious of something else. So then you get that second move to prove that there is an external reality. So you can get the analytic move to a synthetic move to prove that there is something. So he would go, well, if consciousness exists, that means the world, the external world, must exist. So it kind of turns Descartes somewhat on his head, but also pushes the analytic. It's a fascinating argument.
That is really fascinating. Maybe we should spend more time on that, discussing that some other time. Okay, so you've talked about his conception of consciousness a bit, and now I guess you should say something about his conception of God before we move on to talking about Hart's ideas. So what is his conception of God?
Yeah, so we've kind of talked a bit about this, though. In Sartre, there are at least two types of entities that exist. So there's consciousness, and also things that consciousness is conscious of. Yeah, so we can call it consciousness and external reality for the sake of, but that's basically what Sartre calls consciousness and being in itself, in his jargon. So consciousness is always trying to reach out by its own character, to reach out to something else in the external reality. So consciousness is trying to reach being in Sartre's jargon. So that's kind of the ontology as well, if you will. And you can see how the ontology is based on this phenomenological observation that consciousness is always tending to something else. So that's where he builds, this observation is the basis of how he builds, on which he builds his entire system. Now, so I was hoping to avoid the jargon, but it's perhaps helpful to use it here. So
I understand.
So there's consciousness, and then there's being. Yeah. So consciousness is conscious of being or external reality. What Sartre calls the for itself and the in itself. Also nothingness and being, but whatever. So Sartre wants to argue that God is actually the two combined together into one. So what he calls the in itself, for itself. And the reasoning goes something like this. For him, external reality is, to use a traditional term, is self-subsistent in some way. It's not dependent on my mind or my consciousness. So it has the character of aseity, to use the Christian language or the theological language, means it does not need something else to exist by itself. So in that sense, it's kind of like God, because God does not need creation or does not need creatures in order to exist. God is self-subsistent in that sense, a say of God's self. But God is also conscious, yeah, because God does things, yeah. God is aware of things. So God, in that regard, is both in itself and for itself. So it's the synthesis of the two, or the unity of the two, as Sartre would say. So you've got, does that make sense to everyone? That formulation, at least. Now, for Sartre, that's a stupid idea. Why? Because consciousness is by definition not the in itself, yeah, because it's conscious of something that's not itself. So you can't actually have a unity or synthesis of the two. So actually, Sartre would say that that's why the idea of God is actually a contradiction. So God does not exist. But nonetheless, we have this idea of God at work when we try to reach out to know external reality or try to know being. So God is kind of this lingering idea that, as Sartre would say, haunts human consciousness at every move. We can't live without that idea, but at the same time, it's an impossible ideal that we can never reach.
Okay, interesting. So now I'm really kind of more interested to try to understand how his ideas relate to Hart's, because just on a surface level, I'm thinking Hart, he's a Christian theologian. Obviously, he's going to believe that that there's God who's distinct from the universe, and that somehow God grounds existence and presumably grounds human nature. And these are all things that Sartre would say, no, there is no human nature, and there's no God in the sense of a distinct entity that or consciousness that grounds everything. So I guess we should start by talking about Hart's conception of consciousness, and I guess how that relates to Sartre's.
Yeah. So as I said, Hart has a similar, if not a parallel, if not the same, actually, basic definition of consciousness as intentional, as intentionality. So not that qualia stuff, basically. So it's always a directed thing. And in a broader moves, Hart wants to link that to teleology. So there's always a purposiveness. There's always a purpose underlying all acts of consciousness, or just say knowledge. Yeah. And as you said, yeah, Hart would just say God is the ground of being, ground of human nature, ground of that, ground of all that exists. Yeah. But I think one of the interesting things in his work on consciousness, in Hart's work on consciousness, is he also says that God is also the ground of the act of consciousness itself. This is kind of where he comes very close, I would argue, to Sartre. Because recall Sartre, God is the ideal unity of me and the pen, if you will, the consciousness and the object, and the external reality. And for Hart, you go, yes, it's precisely because God is the unity of consciousness and being. So underlying, like Sartre, underlying all acts of consciousness is this idea, or in Hart's terminology, or in Hart's framework, it would be this reality of God that makes this not interaction, but this direction possible, or this relationship possible in the first place. So for both Sartre and Hart, the act of consciousness presupposes, or is like at least is pointing towards this notion of God. But whereas for Hart, that notion is real. For Sartre, that notion is an impossible idea that haunts us, as I said.
Well, I guess that leads then naturally to this final question I have for you is, what is Hart's conception of God? That's important to say, I think, because especially these days, when we use the term God, it can mean quite different things. So it's important to understand what Hart means by God. And I guess maybe you could help us better understand how, obviously it differs from Sartre's, because Sartre doesn't believe, there is such an entity out there, but Hart does. So I guess since they have almost the same conception of consciousness, I'd be interested to hear more about maybe why. Why does Hart not then arrive at the same conclusions? So what's going on here?
Yeah, no, thank you. I should perhaps just add one qualifier, that this might be a good point to do it, is that, and these are a few famous lines in Being Nothingness, the famous work by Sartre that I mentioned already, is that there's some certain lines of like, oh, so when consciousness is trying to reach out to become united with external reality, the pen in my case, and when I truly reach that, I'll become God, but I can never reach it because I'm by definition not the pen. Yeah. So Sartre would say the human is basically this desire to become God, but it's what he calls a useless passion or a futile passion, because we can never reach that goal. And you have a similar thing in Hart, and he's coming out from a particularly strong Eastern Orthodox sense of what we call theosis, or deification, divinization, whatever you call it, basically becoming God as well. So as one becomes united with God through being baptized or whatever, you begin this process of deification, so on and so forth. So in underlying both of their, and Hart associates this with the fundamental character of being human, which is being conscious. So he would argue that having consciousness is already oriented towards becoming God in that regard. So, and again, a similar structure to Sartre. So perhaps this comes to, if I may skip to the bit on like what's the difference, and this is something I threw out there in the paper, which this is a possibility. I'm not sure if it sufficiently explains all of it, but I think philosophical temperament is an important factor here. So because Sartre has quite a bleak view, if some of you've read Sartre, and he sees the whole thing, just all of human endeavors fundamentally, as I said, ends up in this useless passion, or having this tragic thing that we're all condemned to despair, as he says, in Being Nothingness. Whereas in Hart, you have such a strong sense, I'm not sure, he would not say it's optimism, but compared to Sartre, it is that because there is this human desire for knowing something else, and the fundamental thing that one could know, the most ultimate thing that one can know, is God. So if God exists, God must fulfill this desire that humans have in the end. So as some of you would know, Hart comes out with quite a strong view of universal salvation, or more correctly, universal reconciliation with God. So all things being united to God. So the sense of unity is important for Hart, but as it is for Sartre, but for Sartre, he just thinks that's by definition impossible to achieve this unity of all things, or namely between consciousness and being in this case. But I hope that somewhat answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does a little bit. I'm still trying to get my head around, maybe if I can imagine these two fellows in a room having a chat, which would be very entertaining to watch, I'm sure. I just would be curious, what would Hart say in response, I guess, to some of these arguments that Sartre's throwing out there, saying, well, there can't be this unity of being. I don't know. Is there any, off the top of your head, how do you think Hart might respond?
Well, Hart would probably say it's illogical to presuppose that it's impossible to have a unity of the two. Well, to have a real unity of the two, as opposed to an ideal one. So one way that perhaps one response to Sartre from someone who follows Hart's more or less philosophical outlook, if you will, is to say that, well, yeah, obviously there is no unity between being and consciousness in this world, so in an immanent sense, to use that word, but that doesn't mean that, but God is not existing on this level, but God is the transcendent origins of all things. So in that regard, you can say that, well, if Sartre allows for the possibility of this, I don't like this language, but like a two-tier thing, so there's the immanent and there's transcendent. There's not a hugely simplified thing. Then one could say, well, yes, then he would be able to posit that, yeah, God could be both ideal and real, whereas because Sartre does not allow for that, and only keeps things really immanent, if you will, he would not. So that would, from Hart's point of view, it doesn't help that the two names rhyme. The Sartre thing would be illogical by making that move.
Okay. Oh, that's really interesting. Well, thank you for indulging my questions.